The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, everybody, and thank you to the person who asked the question just now, why aren't financial institutions mandated reporters? Good for you, because I think they should be in Nebraska, and maybe somebody will start a movement to make that happen, because if we're going to make a dent into elder financial exploitation, that is one sure way that it can happen. And I also want to thank Eric White for emailing me 3 questions that arose from this morning. Are there states that have sufficient APS staffing? I would say no. I think every state is way, way behind in terms of parity with child protective services. And we've got to do far more to make the people aware, state-wise, county-wise, and federally, as to the deficiencies and what needs to be done. And along those lines, what are some steps state governments can take to increase adult protective services integrity / prevalence? I think it starts with grassroots level, county level, and that's what we did. We were able to, after a year or so, take 2 hours of a public meeting of the Board of Supervisors, which is like a board of commissioners that hold the county purse strings. And we invited 6 victims of elder abuse to tell their story. We showed statistics to the board of how this crime is escalating through demographics, through other things, through public awareness, but how the resources that are being devoted are lacking. And we were able to convince the board to release more money into our budget so we could hire more investigators. And the third question was, what approach do national organizations need to do to help raise awareness for the need for adequate adult protective services? I think the responsibility lies with the National Adult Protective Services, of which I'm on the board. And I think that it lies with constituents to write to their congressional representatives, to their senators, to make them aware of the problems, to give them the statistics, and also to encourage law enforcement to never refuse to take a report. Ultimately, legislatures want stats. They want to see the data. And for example, in a scam situation, if law enforcement refuses to take a report because the suspect is overseas or whatever, then that's not going to help the ultimate argument that we're going to be able to make. We need every agency to make that report, to compile a database. We want every prosecutor's office to keep stats on how many cases they're prosecuting year by year. For example, I can say that in 1996, when we started, I filed about 17 cases of felony elder abuse. By the year 2018, by the time I left, we were filing in excess of 450. So you can see the dramatic increase from 16 to 450 over that period of time. And it's only going to increase as time, but it requires offices to keep records and to supply those stats. Okay, so how do we get the buy-in from local prosecutors? And I hope there are some prosecutors on this webinar today, either in person, there in Lincoln, or streaming through the public sector. Because what I've learned along the way is this. Unfortunately, some prosecutors have fallen into the same misconceptions that I shared with you about law enforcement. And if you go online, you will often see headlines like this, that cases of elder abuse are hard to prosecute. I feel that that is more of an excuse than a reality. Because in my experience, the hardest cases I've ever prosecuted are not elder abuse cases. They are misdemeanor DUIs where the blood alcohol level is 0.09. Those are very tough cases to convince a jury on. But elder abuse cases, I believe, are not that hard to prosecute. The reason that we're giving the headline this is because it's often a fallback position that prosecutors take in order to explain why their case numbers are very low. This article came out of North Carolina as a result of an estate planning elder law attorney who was fed up with the lack of response And in paragraph 2 there, it says, the attorney has worked on a dozen cases in which seniors have fallen victims to fraud, abuse, or neglect. And she said, none of their cases have made their way to criminal prosecution. Nothing ever happens to these people. You steal from one and you move on to the next. People are sitting ducks. So now the journalist went to the elected prosecutor and asked, and this was the response from the prosecutor: many suspects have not been arrested and prosecuted because there is no proof. He went on to say, not one case has been charged or indicted because we haven't had evidence. Do you buy that? Because I don't. It reminds me of a poster that I saw at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. This is the poster. And instead of using the word opportunities, reinstate the word evidence. You cannot find evidence or proof if you're not willing to look for it. And I love the guy in the very back row. He's really committed to not finding anything. You know, he wants to keep his head firmly in the sand. So this is what we've got to do. We've got to convince prosecutors to get our heads out of the sand and to start assigning people to look for the evidence. Now, I know what's going to happen, and because I've had it happen before. I've had prosecutors say, well, that's all well and good, Greenwood. You work in an office with 300 prosecutors. You've got the resources. We don't. And this is my response. I totally get it. I understand. But do you prosecute misdemeanor DUIs? And they all look at me like, of course we do. I said, well, what would happen if you went on TV tonight and explained that because of lack of resources, you do not prosecute misdemeanor DUIs? And every prosecutor I've spoken to said, I would never do that. And their answer is very simple, because if they did, there would be a public outcry, particularly from Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And their acronym would suitably describe their feelings. They would be mad at the prosecutor. So I think we've got to adopt the same kind of priority for these cases. We must never say lack of resources is an excuse not to prosecute them. Never. And if there are a lack of resources, don't just complain about it. Present your lack of resources to your local county board of commissioners and explain the problem and let them decide whether or not it is a priority. Now, remember misconception number 1. Prosecutors need to know that these cases have massive jury appeal. I mean, take these 4 victims for a start. Actually, these are all victims of my Rota defendant. You've all heard of Rota. Now, by the way, this is not the defendant. This is just some poor fellow I borrowed from their website. But the defendant used to work for Rota, but he was fired for dishonesty, but they forgot to ask for the return of his uniform. So one day he decides, I need to rip off some seniors. So he drives over to this retirement community in San Diego where there is independent, assisted, and skilled nursing. And he's smart. He doesn't go to the assisted or skilled because he knows there's staff there. He knocks on the doors of these independent living apartments where these 4 victims all lived. Now he's got his uniform on. You know what he says? Hi, good morning. Management has sent me. There's a problem with your drains and your plumbing. I need to come in and fix it. Oh, okay, come on in. He then directs each victim to go to the rear bathroom and stand there and turn on the hot and cold taps while he's out of sight in the living area. Well, what's he doing? He's stealing whatever he can, small items of value. And he does this to each of these 4 victims. Ultimately, the police do a great job. They identify the suspect, they arrest him, they bring me the case. I've got names of 4 victims. I don't know who they are. I know their ages. And we subpoena them and they come in. Did I ask the gentleman to wear a suit? No. They're all aged between 83 and 100. The 100-year-old is the gentleman with the walker in the white jacket. Now, when I first started out in 1996, my fellow prosecutors made fun of me. And I'll tell you who made fun of me most: the gang prosecutors. Now, you can always tell a gang prosecutor they walk differently. Actually, they don't walk, they swagger. They have an attitude, which they've earned. I give them that because they deal with the toughest cases, and I take my hat off to them. They are brilliant. but they know it, and they really would kind of let me know about it. And they would also tell me, Greenwood, you're doing elder abuse. Who have you upset in the office? They regarded it as a demotion. So they looked down on what I was doing for several months until something happened. And what it was this. Now, look at the victim in the bottom right-hand corner. I'll call her Agnes, okay? Because 95% of all my female victims were called Agnes. When they would see me, and I'm talking about the gang prosecutors now, walking with my victim to court, about to introduce Agnes to my jury, you know what happened with those gang prosecutors? They became obsessively jealous of me. Because picture their victim. Well, you know what victims of gang crimes look like. They are members of the rival gang. How do they come to court? They got the tattoos, they got the attitude, and best of all, they got the jacket. Oh, you know what the jacket is that they wear? It's called an Oakland Raiders jacket. And do you think that goes down well with the San Diego jury? Absolutely not. So, and do they have a rap sheet? Oh, you bet they do. Whereas Agnes, she doesn't even have a speeding ticket on her Buick. So I walk into court, in comes Agnes, she takes the oath, and then she comes through the double gates, and without me even asking, she links arms with me so I can now escort her slowly past the jury box into the witness box. And on the way to the witness box, she turns to the 12 jurors and she says, "Good morning. I guarantee you this, by the time Agnes gets into the witness box, 4 of my jurors want to adopt her as their grandmother." So these cases have absolutely inbuilt jury appeal that I want every prosecutor in America to understand so that they become confident about taking these cases and presenting them. We also need to understand the frustration that develop when cases either don't get filed or get dropped. This is what I got from an APS caseworker, not from Nebraska, from some other state. And this is what this APS worker said. We're struggling to get the prosecutors to charge. And sometimes they plead down, but now they're dismissing cases when civil matters are involved. And then those are cases that are dismissed in civil court. So there's a lot of frustration out there, and we want prosecutors to understand that. Take this article. This is brought to my attention by APS caseworkers in the middle part of the state of California. This happened in Modesto. So there was a scam going on. The suspect was going door to door, convincing elderly homeowners that she had just lost a young child and she didn't have any money for the funeral or for burial. One of the victims was 90. She gave the suspect $14,000, believing it to be a loan, but it wasn't. It was a scam. There's no way she was going to pay her back. The police did a fantastic job. They investigated, they gave the case to the district attorney's office. What was their response? Well, I wouldn't have believed it had it not been in print. This is what the prosecutor said. Simply getting scammed by a smooth talking person is not a crime. If money is given voluntarily, there's no theft. So that is wrong. And that unfortunately shows an intent not to get involved with these cases. And that's bad. And I couldn't resist it. I did get involved. And I must say, to their credit, the office there did reverse that policy and they did ultimately prosecute that case, which was good. So that triangle was created. Social services, law enforcement, and prosecutors. And that's what I would urge you to be involved in if you don't already have a multidisciplinary team approach in your county. Get those 3 agencies working together. Remember the 3 C's that I shared with you at the beginning. You've got to get that working cooperation between the 3 agencies. But then who else needs to be involved in order to bring elder abuse into the spotlight? The medical community. So when I say the medical community, I'm talking about 3 different types of folks. The folks who are right down the front lines. in your urgent care settings, clinics, your nurses, triage nurses, your doctors who are on call, who actually see elderly patients when they come in with all kinds of different suspicious injuries, bruises, whatever. Second group of medical folks is the medical examiner in your jurisdiction, the ones who actually decide whether or not an autopsy is going to be performed. And the third type of medical personnel is your frontline paramedic, your EMT, and often they are cross-reported and cross-qualified as firefighters. So I'm calling them your first responders out there, okay? So these are the key folks. With the hospital urgent care folks, we need to reach out to them. I don't know whether any of them, excuse me, are on this training today, but we need to have that discussion with them about what they determine to be accidental and non-accidental injuries, which are presented to them in the ER room when there's an older adult victim patient. I mean, how does this gentleman end up with these injuries? Are these accidental or are these non-accidental? Obviously, the fact that I've got hold of these tells you that he's a victim of a crime. You look for suspicious injuries under the eye. You look for this. This is where a son shoved a walking stick, a cane, into his mother's eye. You look for those suspicious bruises around the chin. You look for them abrasions around the corner of the eye. You look for the defensive wounds on the wrist where the mother is blocking the blows. You look for the bruising, the telltale signs on the wrist. This is where the son has pulled his mother out of the bed and she falls heavily and breaks her hip. You look for the pressure points on the lower arm where the son or the daughter or the grandson has jammed his fingers into her and he's shaking her and threatening her. You look for the bruising on the neck. You look for those injuries. And then you have the same kind of discussion with your local coroner, medical examiner. What kinds of protocol do you have in place when you get a report from a paramedic that they are at a house and there's a 94-year-old person who's deceased? Do you have any questions that you have of the paramedic? The problem is that too many older adults' deaths are being waived for autopsies simply because of the age. Well, they're 94, therefore they're going to die. So we need to have a better understanding of what needs to happen before the medical examiner in your jurisdiction will waive jurisdiction. We need to train the coroner and or their staff as to what questions to ask. Establish protocols for reviewing suspicious deaths. And I hope, and I'm not sure, but I'm hoping that in Nebraska, you already have established some elder death review teams. You should always have one in Lincoln and in Omaha and maybe other big cities. And if you don't, we need to start one. Why is that? Because too many suspicious deaths of older adults are falling under the radar and are being described as accidental or natural, when in fact they are homicides. Why is such a team important? We've had one in place for many years, looking at suspicious deaths through the medical examiner's office. And why is that? Well, just from this statistic alone, every year in our county, about 20,000 people die, but we only do 2,700 autopsies. And the majority of older adults who die don't ever get seen by a medical examiner for an autopsy. So we have to have a protocol in place as to make sure that certain suspicious deaths don't slip behind the cracks. Why is that? Because of one particular case that we prosecuted. The victim of the homicide was the gentleman on the left. His wife on the right had Alzheimer's. They lived in a, quote, senior community. He was in very good health. He was in his 80s. But one day there was a knock on the door. A young female said, hey, my car's broken down. Can I come in and use your telephone? He let her in. At some point, she went to the bedroom. Mrs. Polchow, who has Alzheimer's, remembers seeing the young lady in her bedroom. It's obviously very confusing. She doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know why she's there. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Polchow comes out of the bedroom and finds her husband dead on the living room carpet. She calls 911. Even though she has Alzheimer's, she knows what to do. And in her kind of message to the operator, she says this: "I think they did something to him." The dispatcher hears that, but doesn't respond to it, but she does call a paramedic and a police officer. The police officer and the paramedic come to the house. They find the elderly man dead on the living room carpet. Mrs. Polchow is pacing up and down, and she's telling the police officer, "She was here, she was in my bedroom, she's gone." At trial, the police officer, somewhat embarrassedly, admitted, "I heard her say those things." "Did you do anything about it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it was obvious to me that she was delusional." That was his conclusion. 2 days later, because no investigation was carried out, 2 days later, they were about to go to the cremation. Bank of America called and said, "Can I speak to Mr. Polchow?" And they said, "Sorry, he's dead." And they said, "Well, that's very suspicious because his credit card is being used, and it was being used from the 2 hours after his death." It was because of that phone call that the police were called in. They took the body from the crematorium. Thankfully, the cremation hadn't occurred. They took it back to the medical examiner's office, and they discovered that he had in fact been strangled to death. They then started a homicide investigation, and they realized that the suspect had been in Mrs. Polchow's bedroom and had stolen jewelry. Where does it end up? At a pawn shop. So they were able to determine which pawn shop it was in Oceanside. They were able to determine who had deposited it there, what time, what date, and they even had the suspect's fingerprint. Perfect. So we were able to identify the suspect pretty quickly and found out that she had a prior conviction from Texas for elder financial exploitation, using distraction as her method, getting entry into a house, saying her car had broken down, and stealing jewelry. It was exactly the same scenario, except for one thing. In the current case, she had murdered the victim. Mrs. Polchow was unable to identify the rings because of her Alzheimer's. No problem. We were able to identify them ourselves through a photograph showing her wearing them. And we got an expert in to identify the pawned rings as being the same rings on her finger. We linked that to the suspect, linked her to the murder, and she was convicted of death and of murder, and she was given a life without parole. Now, there are other lessons to learn. The most famous ones from Britain and from USA are Shipman and Cullen. Shipman was a medical doctor, and for 18 years, he got away with murder, literally. Ultimately, he was convicted of 15 murders, but we believe he murdered in excess of 350 of his patients. 350. How did he do it? He injected them with an excessive amount of morphine on home visits to his patients. Why would he do that? This is not a mercy killing. He was actually forging new wills or codicils, naming himself as a beneficiary. Now you'd think, surely he couldn't get away with that for 18 years, but he did. He absolutely did. He used his authority as a medical doctor to fool everyone. So this is one reason why we absolutely need to look at deaths of elders. Charles Cullen is another example. He was a nurse in New Jersey and Philadelphia, and on his night shift, he would concoct lethal cocktails, gave them all these different overdoses and killed them. He got away with it. Got 11 life sentences. These two ladies in Los Angeles befriended elderly drunk transients on Skid Row. Perfect. Who's going to be concerned when they die? And sadly, not many people. They befriended them, took them back to their home, purchased life policies on their lives, kept them alive for 2 years, because within California, you cannot cash in within the 2-year period. And on the 2nd year anniversary, took them back to Skid Row, gave them alcohol, and then ran them over with their motor cars, murdered them. You can't make stories like this up. And then you've got this nurse who killed 10 in 2006, injecting her victims with a drug. This guy killed 28 in a German hospital. He was a nurse. Lethal cocktail. And just last year in West Virginia, we've got a VA nursing assistant who killed 7 patients, giving them excessive amounts of insulin. So it's happening, and we've got to make sure that the medical examiner is aware of these suspicious deaths and has a protocol in place. Now, what about paramedics? As a prosecutor, I found working with juries that their number one favorite witness, other than Agnes, that I've already described to you, is the paramedic. But I've also found this, that paramedics are often the most overlooked witness in a criminal investigation of elder abuse by law enforcement and prosecutors. Why do I believe that jurors love paramedics? What is the job description of a paramedic or a firefighter who's cross-trained as an EMT? It's to save lives. And in the minds of every single juror in San Diego, a paramedic is a hero. I've never met anyone who detests a paramedic. I've met lots of people who don't like lawyers for good reason. But paramedics are in a totally different zone. Not only do they make great witnesses because of their job description, and this is not scientific, but most paramedics in San Diego are male. When God creates a male paramedic, he never creates an ugly one. Every paramedic in Nebraska either looks like Denzel Washington or George Clooney, a younger version of George Clooney, if they're a male. I promise you. And so when you've got coming into a Lincoln courtroom, a Denzel Washington in a dark blue uniform as a hero and as a witness, it is over for the defendant. Because I guarantee this, witnesses, that paramedics like that, they are believed by jurors. The problem is that when police officers write reports about the paramedic who responded to a scene, they don't write down Denzel Washington's name. They call it Engine 12, and that's no good. You've got to interview the paramedics, but so few law enforcement and so few prosecutors ever take the time to interview the paramedic. So we developed a checklist for paramedics, particularly when they arrive at a scene where the victim is already deceased. Find out, is this person already known to Adult Protective Services? Find out who called 911. Ask the dispatcher to listen again to the tape. What was the demeanor like of the caller? Was there a delay in calling between the time of death and the call to dispatch? Is there any indication the body's been moved from one location to another? Is there any indication in the house of drugs, alcohol abuse, or anything else that raises a red flag? And if so, that EMT needs to immediately bring in law enforcement to hopefully secure the scene as a potential crime scene. Then I learned that 911 tapes themselves can be so valuable, so we want to use them to the best advantage. And so dispatchers need training. So we need to make them part of the training as well. So twice a year, I go to the local academy and teach the new recruit dispatchers about what questions to ask when somebody calls 911. And remember that in a lot of cases, it is the suspect who is calling for paramedics. And that's when the dispatcher can really tie them down to an account, a narrative, which then later we can disprove in court. Then I turn my attention to financial institutions. And why is that? Because elder financial exploitation is now considered to be a US public health concern for good reason. I discovered, and I'm sure you agree, many of these thefts from elders are preventable, and the scams are so preventable. What is needed? We need to train every single bank teller and credit union teller in Nebraska. And so I spent a lot of my time when I wasn't in court, actually in the institutions, talking to bank staff, talking to credit union staff, what red flags to look for. There's resources now, which we didn't have back in the 90s. This is a great resource. Look at this one from the American Bankers Association Foundation. This is a resource guide for banks to partner with law enforcement and adult protective services. Every single bank in Nebraska must have this in their training schedule. I don't know if they do, but they should. And maybe it's us, you in this audience, that's going to make it happen next week. Make sure they have this available because it explains for them the role of APS and of law enforcement. So you heard me say we decided that these folks should all become mandated reporters. And once our law went into effect several years ago, whoa, what happened? The number of cases coming to adult protective services went through the roof. And we were able to actually identify early on far more cases. And the beauty of that is that if banks and credit unions are making that call, we can sometimes stop the bleed before every dollar has been stolen. Because of the prevalence of this crime, it's now being called the crime of the 21st century. And the people who are doing the stealing, variety. I mean, one of the last cases I was involved in before I left was this. Look at this. A Chase Bank employee stealing 300 grand from elderly clients. And she wasn't the only one. I mean, over the course of the 22 years, we prosecuted several bank employees for stealing from elderly customers. The temptation is too great and it's too easy because some banks were sloppy in their oversight of employees who were able to bypass the system and tap into their customers' accounts. So one thing I learned was this, that maybe our perception of what constitutes criminal financial exploitation is far too narrow. And I felt that we need to be able to argue lack of consent much more aggressively. So what I want to do now for a few minutes is give you a stripped down version of what an elder financial exploitation case looks like, whether it be in California or Nebraska, it doesn't matter. I think it's pretty much the same. Now, when we talk about exploitation, you look at the Nebraska statute, okay? And this is the definition, and I have to tell you, I like this. I really like the definition. It is the wrongful or unauthorized taking, withholding, appropriation, conversion, okay? Of money, etc. of a vulnerable adult or senior adult. So those are the two categories of victims. And this is the way it's been done. I like this. By undue influence, breach of a fiduciary relationship, by deception, by extortion, intimidation, force, threat of force, isolation, or any unlawful means, or by breach of fiduciary duty under a power of attorney, hey, power of attorney, trustee, or any other fiduciary. So that's a mouthful, but basically it is wide-ranging. That gives scope to every single police officer in Nebraska to really uncover evidence of some form of intimidation, threat, isolation, undue influence, deception, all kinds of things that they can then give to a prosecutor who can then prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that exploitation has occurred. Now, to really strip down exploitation, there are basically four elements in any statute. It's taking the property, typically money, cash, assets, house, whatever it is, belonging to the victim without the victim's consent and with the intent to permanently deprive. That is the basic definition of theft. And 3 of the 4 elements are pretty easy to prove. The one that gives prosecutors the most trouble is number 3. How do you prove that the taking was done without the consent of the victim? We've got to look at the whole position of lack of consent much more forcefully. How do you do that? One way you can do it is by bringing in somebody else to explain to a jury lack of consent. You bring in the geriatric psychiatrist, somebody who's been treating your victim for cognitive impairments. There's been a diagnosis over many years of dementia, maybe of Alzheimer's, maybe Parkinson's. How has this impacted the ability of the patient to determine different things? So you bring in that kind of medical qualified individual who can point to the diagnosis and who can very clearly tell a jury, my patient does not have the ability to understand what he or she was signing in that document. Or if the victim has already been made subject under a probate court to a conservatorship or a guardianship, you bring in the guardian or the conservator to explain all that. Or you can simply use what I call BWC, body-worn camera footage from the first responding police officer. How is that helpful? The police officer gets a report, hey, there's a case of suspected elder financial abuse. The camera is rolling. They walk into a room. Maybe it's in an assisted living facility. They identify themselves to the alleged victim. And you can tell immediately from the body language, from the response or lack of it, from the victim, that they have no clue what the police officer is talking about. That in itself can be very compelling evidence to a jury that there's no way that the victim understands the transaction. So in California, we have a jury instruction that defines lack of consent, and I like it a lot. And we use it a lot, or we did. And basically, in order for there to be consent, 3 things have to be present. That the victim acted freely and voluntarily, without threats, force, or duress. The victim has to have knowledge of the true nature of the act, and the victim must possess the mental capacity to make an intelligent choice about something proposed by somebody else. If one of those things is missing, it's not consensual. That is a powerful instruction, and I wish every state adopted that definition of lack of consent, because it's a powerful weapon. And the beauty of it is the judge gives that instruction to the jury. So my job is to say, look, we proved it to you beyond a reasonable doubt. The victim did not have knowledge of the true nature of this transaction. Or the victim didn't have the mental capacity to make an intelligent choice about this proposed thing that the suspect was giving to them. The judge will also say the consent requires free will and positive cooperation by the victim. And you can typically show evidence that everything was orchestrated by the suspect. And the victim never showed an independent free will. Now, I want to break it down even further and give you how I would classify an elder financial exploitation case into one of 3 scenarios. And I've listed them in order of complexity, from the simplest to the most difficult. So scenario number 1 is probably the easiest one. Victim testifies. Victim doesn't have any cognitive issues. The victim knows they're a victim. Boy, are they upset. Just like those 7 ladies, the photograph I showed you in session number 1, sitting outside the courtroom, who knew that their jewelry had been stolen by this guy, and they were upset, they were angry, they wanted to testify. So you've got that victim who knows they're a victim of theft, didn't give permission, didn't give consent. I didn't owe any money. And then I always say, make sure that your victim is credible, meaning in the past, I've had some issues with particularly older men giving money to younger women and never really being transparent enough until it comes to testifying under cross-examination, where they have to admit certain things. So if all that plays out, that is a solid case. Here was one of the cases. This is a caregiver. The victim knew she'd had her checks stolen and forged. She said, the only person who had access to my checkbook was my caregiver. He's got to be the crook. Go and arrest him. Well, we couldn't be too hasty, so we investigated. We found out that, in fact, the person in the bank presenting the forged checks was this guy. Who's this guy? He was the roommate of the caregiver. So we charged them with conspiracy to defraud an older adult. And then we started looking at the other evidence. This is a true signature of my victim, okay? This is how she signs her name, G.L. Price. Here is a forged signature. Do we need a handwriting expert to determine for a jury that this is a forgery? I don't think so. I think anyone can see that's a forgery. And besides, we've got the victim saying, that's not my signature. And then, in addition, we've got the bank surveillance video to help us. We've got the suspect standing there in front of the counter. We've got the date and the time. We've got his mugshot. We can compare it. We know it's him. And it's just so easy to put it together. Now, scenario number 2, slightly different. The victim does not testify. Now, remember, I think I said earlier on, that you don't always need the victim alive to be able to prove theft. And this is the situation I'm talking about. The victim doesn't testify. Who do you bring in? Instead, you bring in their treating physician to prove to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that at the time of the transfer of asset, the victim lacked the ability to give consent because of the treatable diagnosis of Alzheimer's, Parkinson, or whatever, okay? So that's who will present the non-consensual evidence to the jury, is the medical person. This was such a case. Okay, so my victim is in the foreground there at the very lowest part of the slide. She's 97, her name is Ruth. The crook is the person pushing her in the wheelchair into the bank. What's he doing with her in the bank? He's a taxi driver. He's picked her up from an Alzheimer's facility and taken her to a bank. And on the way to the bank, he gets her to sign a surrender form to cash in a certificate of deposit worth $98,000. The bank teller, and this was before banks were mandated reporters, and this is one of the cases that I presented to our state capital legislature as to why we needed bank tellers to be trained. The bank teller never asked Ruth one question. They only talked to the guy with the form that had Ruth's signature on it. And the CD was going to be cashed in, and he wanted a cashier's check payable to a third party, whose name was Ricardo Buhane. And the bank asked him, who is Ricardo Buhane? You know what he said? Oh, that's Ruth's lawyer. And because he said lawyer, the bank agreed to do it. So they went and prepared a cashier's check while he waited for $97,000. Why not $98,000? Because they penalized Ruth $1,000 for an early withdrawal of her money. Well, eventually we were able to prosecute this guy and his co-conspirator, Buhane. We never called Ruth to testify. In fact, by the time of the trial, she had already passed away, but we were able to get some measure of justice for her. Now, scenario 3 is the most difficult. This is where we say, oh, it's a theft. The defense is going to say, no, 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 too quick to rush to judgment here. It's a loan. My client borrowed it, or it was a gift. She wanted him to have it. This is a situation where the victim is marginally competent, where the suspect exploited the victim's vulnerability, and we conclude that the victim was unduly influenced or defrauded. Now, again, undue influence is one way of exploitation in Nebraska. It's in your statute. This is where you can really build a fantastic body of evidence against the suspect. What is undue influence? The best definition I ever got was from a lawyer in one of my cases. He was a very reluctant, embarrassed witness that we subpoenaed. He was an estate planning elder law attorney who had amended his elderly client's living trust 9 times until number 10, when he said to the client and to his new bride, the suspect, "I'm not comfortable in doing this. My victim was elderly. My victim had been befriended by this female suspect who was a caregiver. She went literally knocking on the door and she says, 'Do you need help?' At that time, my victim's wife was terminally ill and he was finding it difficult to care for her. He says, 'Yes, I do.' So she literally moved in, a stranger moved in to care for his wife for 3 months. After the wife died, within a week, do you know what happened? The female suspect took my victim in her car and drove 5 hours north on I-15. Now, when you drive 5 hours north on I-15 in San Diego, you come to a place that you may have heard of called Las Vegas. She didn't even bother to get out of the vehicle. She took him to a drive-through chapel and they got married. She took him back to San Diego and started the process of amending his living trust with his lawyer 9 times until finally the lawyer said, "Enough's enough." Now, when he testified to that, this only happened the one time, but the judge really got upset and he leapt out of the chair and he said, "What took you so long?" And this is what the attorney said: "I felt that my client was being pushed in a direction that he did not want to go." And I thought, wow, that's a perfect definition of undue influence. The point is that we have to prove and present evidence that the undue influence removes the consensual nature of the transaction to the point where the victim no longer exercises free will. And it often helps to have your victim evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist or psychologist. What are they looking for? They're looking for susceptibility to being unduly influenced. That's the key, susceptibility. Now, for those of you in law enforcement, this is what I always ask you to do to gather and build a case of undue influence. Number 1, find out how long has victim known suspect. And a general rule that I used for myself was the longer the relationship in terms of years, the less likely it's going to be for me to be able to establish undue influence. The shorter the relationship, the more likely it is that I can indeed establish undue influence. Secondly, where did they meet? I'm always fascinated to know, where did the meeting take place? Right now in Nebraska, there are people meeting older adults for the first time, and they're going to cultivate a relationship where they will exert undue influence. And where are they meeting them? I'll tell you where: the parking lot of Walmart. Why? Have you ever met an older adult who doesn't know where Walmart is? Suspects literally hang out in parking lots looking for a vulnerable victim. They do. Casinos, places of worship, the greengrocer aisle of the supermarket. These are all places where they will look for a victim. Thirdly, I want law enforcement to tell me as to the prior spending habits of my victim. And typically the profile we can present to a jury is that before meeting the suspect, the victim was frugal. Didn't spend much, wasn't lavish, wasn't extravagant, but then after they met the suspect, boy, the spending went up. And they bought all kinds of inappropriate things, went to all kinds of places which they'd never frequented before. Fourthly, look at the history of charitability prior to meeting the suspect. Remember, the defense is going to sometimes be, it's a gift. So even though it sounds a bit harsh, we want to prove to the jury that that is nonsense, because never has the victim ever given a gift of that magnitude, even to a loved one. And what's the best way to prove that? If the victim has a grandson or granddaughter who's graduated from junior high or high school, find out how much they gave that grandchild by way of a graduation gift. And the maximum typically of the gift is going to be $100 at most. And you compare that gift to a grandchild that they love dearly to the suspect that they only met 3 months ago, and they're giving them a check for $17,000. It doesn't make sense. And then you look at what is left, and you can argue that they needed that money that they've given away for hidden expenses, for medical unforeseen emergencies. And then you look at the escalating transactions. You know, once the suspect gets their claws into a victim, they steal a little bit of money, they're going to come back and steal more. So there will be more transactions that you can probably uncover. And then finally, you look at the statements made by the suspect to the victim to convince the victim that the suspect is a good person. And you can then take those statements and use them against the defendant to prove that they are lies. One of the common lies that a suspect will use is to establish some kind of common denominator with the victim, such as, oh, so you're not from San Diego? No, I was born in Iowa. No kidding, so was I. And so by that, you have this immediate bond between victim and suspect because of apparent same state where they originated from. And you prove that, no, this suspect was not born in Iowa, they came from Florida. And then you build the case. You obtain the evidence. You get the bank surveillance tapes. And you've got to be very timely with that because sometimes banks, frustratingly, will override the bank tape and use it again after 60 days. You get the prior medical records. You look for the inappropriate purchases. How many times have we seen suspects purchase gifts, things at Victoria's Secret or apply for a 24-hour fitness club membership, which doesn't really go with the profile of a 96-year-old victim. And then I always say, when you think you've asked enough questions, ask more. Here's one of the problems that I found, not just in elder abuse cases, but generally. We never ask enough questions. How do I know that? Because in trial, I don't adhere to what they teach us in law school. And in law school, they always tell us, don't ever ask a question in trial to which you do not know the answer. That's boring. So I would invariably ask my witness questions, unscripted, spontaneous questions, which would so often open up a whole new area, to the point where during the break, the defense attorney would get very agitated and say, Your Honor, Mr. Greenwood is trying to do a trial by ambush. We have had no discovery on these admissions that the witness is making. And we go outside and talk to the witness outside of the presence of the jury. And we say to the witness, why is it that today is the first time you've ever said that? And the answer is always the same. Nobody ever asked me that question before. So we should always go into these investigations in the knowledge that witnesses know far more than we give them credit for. We have to extract the information from them by asking questions and keep asking. Now, a classic example of scenario 3 is this one. The victim testified, but he was vulnerable in so many ways. He had short-term memory problems, areas of extreme vulnerability. There he is on the left. On the right is his caregiver's girlfriend and their daughter. The caregiver was a male. My victim was a man who had suffered several adverse problems. He had just lost his life partner. My victim was a gay man in his late 70s who found it very difficult to tell people that he was gay. And when he lost his life partner, he was distraught. At the same time, he was diagnosed with some form of cancer and he had to undergo cancer surgery treatment for which he needed rehabilitation. The family brought in a male caregiver through the agency. And this male caregiver, although he was heterosexual, realized that he could take advantage of my victim's sexual preferences and tease him and tempt him and do all kinds of things with him. And he floated that out there and in return was getting my victim to sign checks to buy gifts, such as a car, such as toys for his several children, such as alcohol and other things, and even a big screen TV. Now that dates this case, obviously. We arrested the suspect, and when we arrested him, we found that he was on the move, and he had in his possession things belonging to the victim. This is a note written by the victim, and he basically said, I'm authorizing the suspect to have my credit card. In the suspect's possession was also a letter written by the victim explaining what had happened when he had gone to his bank to withdraw $40,000. And in that letter, he said, in writing this, I make it clear that it was my error. In no way did Don Harris have anything to do with my bank transaction. That letter was written by the victim and was in the suspect's possession. Also in the suspect's possession was an audio tape of the victim's voice. And on that tape, this is what was said. If ever Don Harris is accused of abusing me, it is all a false allegation. Now, why on earth would the suspect have that? And whose idea would it be to get that done? You know, and I know. It was all the suspect's doing. He unduly influenced the victim. When we arrested him, he was in the car with a girlfriend. Actually, he had just married a girlfriend, and they were going out of town. But it wasn't his current girlfriend that he had married. We went to her and we told her, oh, by the way, did you know that your boyfriend had just got married? Oh my goodness. She was extremely upset and angry. And she said, well, you know what? That's it. And she went home and produced for the first time a document. This is the document that she produced. I promise never to call the police on Don Harris and claim he is physically, emotionally harming me in any way. If I do call the police and claim any of the above, it will be a false allegation. Have you ever seen anything like that? I hadn't before then. Why on earth would she write that? Did you believe it? No, of course not. Whose idea was it? It was his idea to do it. And why did you agree to do it? Because he promised to marry me. Well, when you see something like that, that explains the type of MO that this suspect uses to exert undue influence, not only over an older adult, but over a girlfriend. So we were able to put that case together, and the jury was totally on board, and they convicted him of elder financial exploitation. The problem is the predators out there are relying on the fact that they think they can get away with it. Right now in Nebraska, there are people out there brazenly stealing money from older adults, and they are cocky, they're arrogant, they're walking into a bank right now somewhere in Omaha and Lincoln and getting away with it because they think that nothing's going to touch them. And, you know, it's all different types, different methods, but the same aim, how to rip off the older victim. And for example, here's a scenario. One of my crooks dressed up as an FBI agent. Now, how do you pose as an FBI agent? Well, you wear a very fancy suit, because have you ever met an FBI agent who doesn't wear an expensive suit? No. So they wear expensive suits, they flash a fake badge, they have a fake photograph in their wallet, they produce a fake business card. So he called himself Ross Walker with a real telephone number. And when my victim phoned that number, she gets his voice. Hi, this is Special Agent Ross Walker. Please leave your name and number and I'll get back to you. So my victim believed that she was dealing with the FBI. And of course, his idea was to convince her to withdraw all of her money from the bank and let him count it out, because he believed that he told her that her money was being stolen. Well, thankfully, she called the San Diego police, and they, within 10 minutes, figured it out that this was a bogus thing. So we arrested him. His name wasn't Ross Walker. And when we arrested him, we did a search warrant on his house. And this is classic. This is a script of a crook. Look at the top. We're with the FBI, flash the badge. Duh. I mean, he even had to remind himself to do that. So we've also got to train financial institutions as to what to look for. You know, I have got, over the years, multiple calls, and I still get them when I'm doing webinars for AARP from adult children. What can I do to try to prevent my parent from becoming a victim? And I tell them this: if there's a change in circumstances, such as you're introducing a caregiver into the house where your elderly parent lives, you need to write a letter to your mum or dad's bank manager or credit union manager and let them know of the change in circumstances and ask them to keep a special eye on the activity on the account. Because when a caregiver is introduced, things can happen. Here is this caregiver. This is a female caregiver who stole almost $600,000 from an elderly man in San Diego. We've never recovered his body, but the jury agreed. She not only stole from him, she murdered him. We don't know when, where, or how, because we've never recovered his body. But we know she murdered him, and the jury agreed. And she's now serving life without parole. This gentleman on the left, Jack Parks, was 98 when this photo was taken on his birthday. He was murdered by his caregiver. He lived in a mobile home park. When his wife died, he needed a caregiver, so he put an ad in the newspaper. She started forging his checks, and he found out, because at the top of the page there, you'll see the word forged, and he confronted her. And he said, I can have you arrested. Do you know what she did? She said, hey, hold on, Jack. Just remember, if you have me arrested, there'll be nobody to take care of you, and the police will take you away and put you in a nursing home. He believed her. So he didn't call police. And as a result, she was allowed to stay. And 6 weeks later, she starts a fire in the house. She ties him up. She puts burning papers on him. She stabs him in the ear. She ties him up, as I say, and she takes every phone out of the house, and then she disappears. Ultimately, he breaks free, but he's so exhausted, he doesn't have the ability to walk out of the house. He can't phone anybody because she's stolen the phones. All he can do is write down on a piece of paper 3 words: arrest Julie Spencer. And there it is. Because in his mind, he's going to die. And when he dies and the police find him there, they'll know who to call, who to arrest. So he's bleeding from his ear, he staggers to his bed. The next morning he wakes up alive, and so he gets into his car, which he hasn't driven for several months. It starts, and he drives down the street in the mobile home park, but slumps over the steering wheel in sheer exhaustion. And the horn is blaring because he's actually pushing on the steering wheel horn. The neighbors come rushing out, they call 911, and he's whisked off to the hospital. She had broken 4 bones in his left eye from punching him. She had stabbed him in the ear. She had punched him in his left arm, and she kicked him in the ribs. Now, he was 98 years of age. He had a pre-existing medical condition called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. 8 weeks after this photo was taken in the hospital, he dies from bronchial pneumonia. So now it leaves me to explain to the jury through the medical examiner that when you die from bronchial pneumonia, but it's been caused because the suspect has kicked you in the ribs and caused a broken rib, and as a result, you are now bedridden for 8 weeks with restricted breathing. That's what happens. You get bronchial pneumonia. The bronchial pneumonia was caused by her kicking him in the ribs. So she's responsible for his death. So therefore, she's responsible for his murder. It's a homicide. So ultimately, she's convicted by the jury, and she's now serving 17 years to life. And then you get a true hero like a Pearl Harbor survivor. His caregiver isolated him from his neighbors. The neighbors got worried. They called Adult Protective Services, who brought in a deputy sheriff to do a welfare check. Knock on the door, they could hear something going on in the background, but nobody was opening the door. So the deputy sheriff, bless his heart, didn't wait for a search warrant. He busted the door down. Finds the victim laying in filth in the kitchen. How did she get away with it for so long? She isolated the victim by putting up signs. Don't knock, don't disturb because he's sleeping. Pushing away any people who wanted to come in and talk to him. In the back bedroom, she had the cash that she'd been stealing using his debit card at the bank every week. And then there are the predators who target a lone older victim. Here is my victim of a vacuum cleaner salesman. You've heard of Kirby vacuum cleaners? How do they sell their vacuum cleaners? In home visits. This guy sold my victim a Kirby vacuum cleaner, but 6 weeks later, knocked on her door at 10 o'clock at night, got her to open the door. He came in because he wanted to use the telephone, and then he kidnapped her. And he bundled her into her car, duct taped her, and kept her prisoner in the trunk of her car for 26 hours. Thankfully, the car was eventually stopped because he blew through a red light. And little did the deputy sheriff know that he would find in the back of the car a shovel, the Kirby vacuum cleaner, and in the trunk was this poor elderly lady who was almost dead, beaten up to a pulp. I prosecuted him for torture and other forms of elder abuse, and he's now serving a life term. And then you've got the scams out there. And you all know the various scams. The US Senate Special Committee on Aging has published several reports, excellent reports. I would urge you to download them, called Fighting Fraud. It lists the top 10 scams, and I'm sure you recognize all of them. And I think this afternoon you're going to have an excellent presentation from the Attorney General's office about these scams. The latest report is this one that just came out about a month ago. Again, it's called Fighting Fraud. And this time they're talking about the top 5 scams since 2015. Again, it's government impersonation, sweepstakes, illegal robocalls, computer and grandparent scams. Now, the grandma scam is a very classic one, is it not? You know how that works, but listen to this.
Last December, Beth Baker received a call about her grandson, Will. Her grown son, Jim Baker, knew nothing of it at the time, but Will Brown was in danger. Trouble was, the phone call was a hoax.
I got a call one morning, and they said that Will was in Peru and that he was in trouble and that he had not been drinking, but someone in the car had been drinking. And there was an accident and someone was hurt.
It began with a request for $600 to help her grandson, but over the course of a week, the amounts got larger. So large that it got to the desk of Deputy District Attorney Paul Greenwood. And like many scams that target seniors, it had the heartbreaking commonality of using the combination of love and fear to steal money.
She is a lady. So you've seen that victim, articulate, intelligent, not in the least bit impaired. She was a loving grandmother who was convinced that her grandson was in South America and in danger. She was instructed by the crooks to go to various kiosks and various 7-Elevens and Walgreens and Walmarts and CVS to purchase gift cards and Green Dot prepaid cards, $67,000 worth. Well, we tracked this case because, in fact, the son, Jim Baker, was a colleague of mine. He was a former prosecutor, and he brought it straight to my office. And we were able to, through some great detective work, track where this case led. And ultimately, it led to a flowchart that connected with other suspects in India. And ultimately, this case was funneled through the U.S. Attorney's Office in Houston, and our suspect in Southern California was part of a 52 defendant indictment from all over the world, where they were brought to Texas, and it was a very successful prosecution. So it is possible, even with one case of grandma scam, to turn it sometimes into a bigger case. Here was another case where the victim was an elderly Japanese lady who was befriended on the telephone. The crook got a taxi driver to drive over to the facility, pick her up, take her to the bank, withdraw the money, bring her to CVS, and purchase the gift cards. And there he is on the phone after she scratches off the numbers. At first, they used Green Dot prepaid cards, as I mentioned, but then there's been a switch to primarily iTunes cards, but now also store gift cards such as Best Buy, Target, and the like. Sweepstakes scams, you know how they work. Here's one email I got from a retired Catholic priest who was the victim of the Publishers Clearinghouse scam. He lost $41,000. And when we got this email, number one, it was so unusual for a victim to admit that they had been victimized in this scam. Secondly, I knew that if I sent this over to the police, they would probably reject it as being unworkable. So I convinced my office that we should work it, so we did. Thankfully, the victim, the priest, had wired the money through a bank, and it ended up in a bank account 3,000 miles away in Greenville, South Carolina. This crook had opened the account 3 days earlier with a bogus name and bogus social security. So we didn't know who he was, except we knew what he looked like, with multiple tattoos on his neck. So because of those visible tattoos, we decided to send this photo to every single law enforcement agency within a 50-mile radius of Greenville. Bingo. A detective recognized him and gave us his true name, and we arrested him and indicted him and brought him back to San Diego. So it is possible to do some of these cases. And then you've got victims who get letters purportedly from the IRS. No, the IRS does not have, do you see at the top there? Internal Revenue Service Lottery Claims Department. Lottery? Crooks do not know how to spell. And then this victim who got an envelope apparently from Chicago. No, it didn't come from Chicago, because look at the right. It's in French, came from Quebec. Inside the envelope was a letter congratulating my victim that she's the $1 million winner. Inside the letter was a check, a bogus check for $5,400 that she cashed at the bank. The bank allowed her to take out $3,900, even though this was an uncleared check, which she then sent back to the crooks. Thankfully, the bank took the loss on this one. And then you've got investment frauds. And I want you to watch this video, or part of it.
Dr. Neil Gallagher is a premier true American with integrity in all his pursuits. His key goal is to help others take responsibility for their financial future. His life's passion is to help people retire safe, early, and happy. Steeped in history, Dr. Neil Gallagher earned his PhD from Brown University. He received his financial license and began working as a broker with firms in New York and St. Louis. Shortly after this period, Dr. Gallagher determined that the financial world of selling stocks and bonds, mutual funds, CDs, and more was not effectively educating the public. As he puts it, I dumped big broker and developed my own company dedicated to educating, empowering, and encouraging people whom are now his clients.
I strongly believe that as a society, we some time ago crossed a threshold in which a great number of individuals today give up on themselves too easily. We've raised a generation who not only looks to others to rescue them in virtually every matter concerning their lives, but one that also demands that others, whether parents, friends, employees, or the government, immediately solve their problems to their liking. Freedom requires education and empowerment, and I educate and empower clients. Less government, more personal responsibility, and with the help of God, a better world.
Well, what do you think of that, gentlemen? And do you think that he would be fairly impressive to elderly people? Absolutely. He's got all the charm and all the charisma. He's got all the vernacular. He uses God. And his tagline was, "I'll see you in church next Sunday." Well, the same man in this week's news. Just absorb that. The man you've just been watching on his YouTube video is now serving 3 life terms. The prosecutor's office in Fort Worth said he's one of the worst offenders. He ruthlessly stole from his clients. he amassed $32 million worth of losses to all of his clients. He worked his way around churches preying on people who believed he was a Christian. Not only that, the year before, he pled guilty to similar charges in the next door county in Dallas, sentenced to 25 years in prison. So this is a classic example of an investment abuser. We had ours in San Diego, and I prosecuted this guy, Jeffrey Milton, who had created a fraudulent charity. He actually convinced the IRS to give him a charitable status. He called himself Senior Rescue, and using that, he created fake documents, fake investments, and managed to convince older investors to cash in their hard-earned savings and for the offer of a 6% return on their money to give him the money. So you get people like this lady writing out checks for 150 grand at a time. And then I had a Gemstone Scam artist who never met his victims, but who would persuade them to cash in their investments and purchase gemstones, sometimes for 100 grand, 200 grand, but they were worthless. There he is. He lived in a gated community in San Diego, and the only good thing was that the house was sold after he was arrested, and we were able to recoup 90% of all the monies that he stole from the proceeds of sale of his multi-million-dollar house. And so now the investment industry is becoming more involved, as you heard in the prior session. FINRA is taking a very active role. I would urge you to be in touch with them whenever you have an investment fraud. They have this rule, which the Nebraska statute has followed, which allows a FINRA member to put a temporary hold on a suspicious transaction. And then the presenter mentioned NASA, the North American Securities Administrators Association, a bit of a mouthful, but it's called NASA. And they have their own website with Senior Investor Resource Center, which is excellent, and Serve Our Seniors, which is also excellent. And as you heard this morning, you've got this new Nebraska law, which has taken effect as of September the 1st. Watch out for bogus charities. And the Federal Trade Commission are excellent at providing information about bogus charities. The sweetheart scam is going through the roof. You heard of one instance this morning in the prior presentation of the daughter who lost $500,000 to the romance scam through getting the crooks getting her to send money through this Bitcoin cryptocurrency scam. Through the romance scam, there's two major types. The face-to-face con artist, who actually befriends an elderly person who's lonely and isolated. And yeah, they seek out their victims in those kinds of places that I've already mentioned: parking lots, places of faith, casinos, grocery stores. But the second type is the more common, which is the anonymous crook online. And some of these crooks are actually operating the romance scam from within the prison walls. It's so easy to smuggle a cell phone within a prison. And that's what they're doing with their time. Or they're operating from overseas. And sometimes we get lucky, and the US Attorney's Office in Virginia has to be congratulated for prosecuting this fella who was operating the romance scam. And then we've got computer hijacking, which is again prevalent with people portraying themselves as Microsoft employees and then getting you to download the software so they can hijack your computer. And then, of course, we've now got COVID-19 scams. If that's not enough to deal with, we've got these scams. And the headlines are reflecting what we're seeing, which is elder abuse climbing during the pandemic. It's a virtual pandemic and on the rise. Why? The number one reason why we're seeing so many more COVID-19 related scams is because the victims are isolated. They're lonely. They're falling for it. They're scared. They're scared for their health. And our AARP has issued an article about the 10 red hot scams. I'm going to give you 5 of them about vaccine scams, telling people on the phone here, especially for the booster scam. If you pay this money, we'll get you the booster. Or you can buy it online. or buy an air filter, and it's going to eradicate COVID-19 from your house. What about the good neighbor who posts on nextdoor.com? Hey, if you're a housebound senior and you're too fearful to go to Trader Joe's, to go to Whole Foods to do your shopping, I'll do it for you. Just give me a debit card. Or crooks posing as Medicare representatives, trying to sell you a home test kit to make sure that you haven't tested positive for the virus. There's a Federal Trade Commission has lots of good information on their website. We've got to understand also the knock-on effect that the pandemic is having on the criminal justice system. And one of the ways it's having a very negative impact is early release of defendants from custody. So to avoid the spread of the virus, non-violent offenders are being released early back into the communities. Where do they go? They go home to their elderly mothers, and those kinds of cases reoccur. Or you get defendants charged with elder exploitation in Nebraska, but they're only being given a citation to reappear 6 months later. So we've got to figure out a way to preserve the older adult's testimony after the case has been issued, to avoid what we call a Crawford problem, meaning that if something happens to your victim after the case has been issued and before the case ever gets heard in court in a trial, we are no longer allowed to use their out-of-court statements to prove theft or whatever it is. It's called the Crawford case. So we've got to figure out ways that we can actually preserve their testimony, maybe through a criminal deposition, somehow or other, where their testimony is recorded and the defense has an opportunity to cross-examine them. I also want to just briefly turn my attention to home improvement fraud. Every contractor in Nebraska has to register with your Department of Labor. And there's a good website so that if an elderly homeowner feels they've been ripped off, or even before they get ripped off, if they're thinking of doing business with a contractor, they can search through the website to check them out. There's also even a list of contractors who have outstanding citations, which I find very helpful. And I just downloaded it last night. Here are some of the contractors that I think you may want to avoid because they're on a public website. These are contractors in Nebraska who today still have outstanding citations against them. So you may want to not want to do business with one or more of these particular contractors. And the Attorney General's office has great information about these kinds of cases, how to choose the right contractor, do your research. And then if you want to report fraud, you click on the button at the top and you get a checklist and you can fill it out. So protect yourself against these scams, which leads me to another misconception. Unfortunately, if you want to report a case of home repair fraud, sometimes if it goes to local law enforcement, they'll consider it to be a civil matter. But no, you look to see if your contractor is licensed or in the state of Nebraska registered. Are there other victims out there? How much money did he get up front? What did he promise to do? And what did he actually do? Here is an example of one case I'm talking about. My victim wrote to me and said, the defendant and his wife, Marissa, ripped him off. They took $26,000. They even took his belongings in a U-Haul and never returned. Another $11,000. He says, I called the police, Mr. Greenwood, but they said it was a civil matter. Wrong. You know, there's some great cases out there. We just got to find them. And here's one where the crook called himself Father and Daughter's Christian Construction Company. And this is designed to appeal to an elderly Christian homeowner to fall into his trap. And then once he's got you in his trap, he'll write out this handwritten contract full of spelling mistakes, which again is circumstantial evidence of dishonesty, and rip you off. One of the very last contract cases I completed involved a licensed registered company called GDS. Now watch out for GDS because they probably are doing business in Nebraska. And the way they do it is they put in a local name ahead of GDS. So like Lincoln Garage Door Services Company. The way they've trained their technicians, and we have proof of this, was, and they're based out of Dallas, Texas. They train their technicians to upsell and to overcharge for services that are not needed on a simple garage door repair. For example, they charged one or more of my elderly victims $4,000 for a simple garage door repair. And we eventually prosecuted him. So watch out for contractor scams. They're out there, particularly in Nebraska, when you've had lots of different disasters like floods or tornadoes. Turn to clergy and faith-based groups. They can sometimes spot isolation before others. We wrote hundreds of letters to local clergy and religious leaders across our county, urging them to adopt a proactive visitation policy. Whenever they spotted that one of their regular members was no longer at church, make an unannounced visit to the home. And if a suspect, stranger person doesn't let you in, consider that to be a huge red flag and call for adult protective services and local law enforcement to do a welfare check on your parishioner. So I called it the empty pew to make unannounced visits. And then I'll deal with this before I take one of the questions. I became aware of a growing problem involving guardianship abuse. If you've never heard about this case, I would urge you to read about it. It's called Nevada against April Parks. This is the worst case probably that we have seen in the last few years. And there's two ways to learn about it. One way is to read this excellent article called The New Yorker magazine, How the Elderly Lose Their Rights. It's downloadable, PDF, just read it. And when I read it for the first time, I honestly thought, how can this happen in the United States of America? It's shocking, but it really shows you what's going on. And also think about downloading from Netflix, not from Netflix, from Amazon Prime or from iTunes, this documentary called The Guardians. I'm just going to play you a very brief snippet to show you the quality of this documentary.
If you are considering retiring here and you're an elderly, wealthy person, think twice.
I spoke to my mom on Thursday and she was fine. I called her on Friday and there was nobody picking up. Somebody took my parents.
It's not supposed to happen in America.
I was fighting them back and he was fighting me.
They grabbed me and they kept telling me, you'll love it there.
I asked them where I was. You're on the 6th floor in the psych ward.
People go in, corpses come out.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and appoint your guardian today.
A guardian is appointed through the courts to have authority over someone's life.
You turn over immediately your bank account, checking account, savings account.
They're using senior citizens as the key to the money.
We have nothing left. There are relationships between the doctors, the lawyers, the private guardian industry, and the court.
My aunt was victimized based on an incorrect diagnosis by an unqualified person.
They were trying to convince us nothing to see here, and that raises red flags for any investigative journalist.
We've got to keep the light shining on the people that are being taken.
I cannot do this. I cannot let these people get away with everything.
It needs a master investigation.
That's the documentary. Now, you may have seen this Netflix film, which is more Hollywoodish, a little more fiction, but still there's an underlying truth to it called I Care a Lot. So I would urge you to also watch that because it is going on. And there could be an April Parks in your jurisdiction. We found one in ours. She was actually on our multidisciplinary team and was a professional fiduciary who, unknown to us, had a gambling addiction and was stealing from her own clients. Similar stories all over the country, and we're potentially missing a lot of red flags. I realize I'm running out of time, so what I'm going to do right now, and I will make the rest of this presentation available to you. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to try it if I can. I'm going to just fast forward here to the very end, and then I want to give you some resources that are available. Before I left the office, we created our first ever blueprint for San Diego County. This is what it is. It's about 50 pages, PDF version. I'm going to send it over to DHSS. And if you want a copy, you can ask them to send it to you, because I think it's a great model to start or expand any community, local, county, multi-district team that you may have as an elder abuse task force. It's got various help to it. And this is one example, one page. Also, don't forget to go to the website for the National Center on Elder Abuse. One project that is fantastic is called the EAGLE Project. It stands for Elder Abuse Guide for Law Enforcement. I hope that every single law enforcement officer in Nebraska knows about this project before the end of 2022. I hope every law enforcement officer in Nebraska will get trained in. If you'd like more information on how we can train law enforcement in Nebraska, let me know, and I will put you in touch with the right people. I'm part of a team that hopefully will go out next year in 2022 and train actual law enforcement agencies on how to use it. It's very user-friendly. Here's an example of one of the pages. It's a drop-down menu. You go to the state of Nebraska, gives you all the laws, gives you help and guidelines on different types of investigations, on how to use document bed sores and things like that. It's really phenomenal. Again, don't forget that ABA Foundation document that I referred to earlier. Don't forget to use the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau website. They're excellent. Don't forget the Federal Trade Commission. And the feds have also something called the Elder Justice Initiative. And that's excellent. Don't forget ARP Fraud Watch Network. I have a top 10 tips for seniors that I can send, and I'll send that also to the DHSS. And so as I finish, I want to give you this thought. Today is about putting elder abuse and vulnerable adult abuse into the spotlight. Pursuing justice for victims should be our passion. Strengthening our professional response should be the plan. And expanding the team should be our purpose. When you have passion, a plan, and a purpose, you add one more P, perseverance, and then it's amazing what we can achieve together. It's a high goal, I know that, but reaching every older adult victim in Nebraska should be our goal today. And so the message not in Iowa, in Nebraska, excuse me, passion, purpose, and perseverance is my key. This is my contact information. As I say, I will make sure that DHSS gets the presentation minus the photographs, which they can then distribute to you at a later time. I hope that some of you, if you have follow-up questions, which I don't have time to answer now, feel free to email me and I'll be more than happy to do one-on-one. And if you ever have a case that you need somebody to just look at objectively as well, I'll be more than happy to do that at no problem. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. And with that, I'm going to hand back to the podium. Thank you.
Very good. Well, Paul, this has been an outstanding presentation. For those of you that completed the evaluation the last time, you know that you asked for Paul to be part of this training. And when you ask, you receive, and we are just beyond grateful to have you join us in Nebraska and to share your wisdom. So thank you, sir, very much.
My pleasure. And I hope next time we do a training, I can be there in person with you, because I really miss coming. Thank you.
We'd love to have you back in Nebraska. So Paul, again, thank you. We are now going to break for lunch, and we will resume at 1:30. At that time, Dr. Ann Fruehling will be our next speaker, and we look forward to hearing her presentation, and we hope you all have a wonderful lunch. So thank you again, Paul. Thank you very much.